It had been 12 long years, 12 years of silence, of emptiness, of loneliness that I had come to accept as my reality. I wasn't sure what had changed in me during that time, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the person I used to be. 12 years ago, I had left. My parents had rejected me, written me off like I was nothing, and I had walked away, hoping that somehow I could find peace in the distance. I was young, full of anger and confusion, convinced that they didn't love me the way I needed to be loved. But over time, the anger faded, and in its place was a quiet ache, a yearning for something that I hadn't known I was missing. I had built a life for myself, far from the small town I grew up in, far from the family who had made me feel like an afterthought. I had carved out a new identity, one that didn't rely on my parents or their approval, but no matter how hard I tried, there was always a nagging feeling, a pull, reminding me of the people who had once been my world. And then, one day, I received the news. My father had fallen ill. The doctors didn't give him long. It was the first time in over a decade that I had been forced to think about them, about my family. I didn't know why I was suddenly compelled to return, why after all this time I felt like I had to be there. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the thought that this might be my last chance to see him, or maybe it was something deeper, something I hadn't even realized existed inside me. So I did it. I made the decision. I booked my flight. I packed my bags. I was going home. The drive from the airport felt surreal. As I approached the house, memories flooded back. The old house on the hill, the one where I had grown up. It hadn't changed much. The same weathered porch, the same cracked windows, the same faded door. Everything felt familiar, but at the same time, so distant, so foreign. I parked in front of the house and just sat there for a moment, staring at the door. Should I knock? Should I just walk in like nothing had happened? Like I hadn't been gone for 12 years? Could they even forgive me? Could I forgive them? I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out onto the familiar dirt path that led to the front door. My heart was racing. My palms were sweaty. Was I ready for this? And as I reached for the doorbell, a thought crossed my mind, one that I hadn't allowed myself to think in years. Maybe they wouldn't want me here. I hesitated, then rang the bell. The seconds felt like hours as I stood there, waiting. My hand still on the doorbell, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent, the air still, as if everything had frozen in time. I hadn't been home in so long, and now that I was standing at the doorstep, I felt like I was waiting for permission to re-enter, for them to let me back into their lives. I heard footsteps from inside, and then the door slowly creaked open. My mother. She stood there, frozen for a moment, her face unreadable. Her eyes widened as she saw me. She hadn't aged much, but there was something in her gaze that was unfamiliar, something distant, like she had built walls around herself that had never been there before. "Mom!" The word came out in a whisper, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid over the years. There was so much to say, but I didn't know where to start. I wasn't even sure she wanted me here. She blinked several times, her eyes filling with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, as if ashamed of her emotions. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with confusion, hurt, and a hint of disbelief. I swallowed hard, fighting back the emotions that had been building up for years. I heard about Dad. I wanted to see him. I didn't know how to explain it any better than that. I didn't know how to explain the deep, gnawing need that had brought me back here after all this time. She stepped back as if unsure whether to let me in, then hesitated before stepping aside and silently motioning for me to enter. I stepped over the threshold, the familiar smell of the house wrapping around me like an old blanket. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had last been here. So many memories, some good, some painful, came rushing back, each one more vivid than the last. I followed her into the living room, where my father was sitting in his old chair by the window. He looked frail, thinner than I remembered, but there was something about the way he sat, like he was still holding on to the strength that had once been the backbone of our family. His eyes flickered to me as I entered the room, and I saw the recognition in them before his lips parted to speak. "You're here," he said, his voice raspy and weak, but there was something in his tone that made me feel like I was a stranger, not out of anger but out of sadness, like he couldn't believe I was standing before him. I walked closer, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. He reached out a hand, and for a moment, I almost broke down. This was my father. The man I had spent so many years resenting, the man I had tried to forget. But in that moment, all the anger seemed to dissolve. The anger wasn't gone, but it didn't matter. "I came back because I needed to," I said, my voice cracking. "I needed to see you both, to understand why I left." My mother sat on the couch across from us, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She hadn't said anything, hadn't even moved. Her eyes were fixed on me, and I could tell she was waiting for something. Maybe an apology, maybe some explanation, but I wasn't sure I had either of those things to give. "Why now?" my father asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years, why now?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the room fell into silence once again. The tension in the room was palpable. I didn't have a good answer. I had no explanation that would satisfy the questions they had about my return. All I knew was that something had shifted in me over the past few years, and now facing them again, I could finally admit the truth to myself. I needed them. I didn't know how to come back," I said, swallowing hard. "I thought it would be easier, that time would make it better, but it didn't. I'm here because I have nothing left. I just need to know if there's any way we can start over." My mother looked down, tears spilling over the edge of her eyes as she shook her head slowly. "I don't know if we can start over," she said, her voice trembling. "The things that happened, they can't be undone." I knew this wouldn't be easy. Starting over wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words or gestures. But I had to try. I didn't know how, but I was determined to try. I had to start somewhere. The silence that followed felt suffocating. The weight of my mother's words hung in the air, and I could feel the gravity of everything unsaid between us. But despite her hesitation, despite the deep hurt we both carried, I knew something important was beginning to shift. We were talking, finally. We weren't just ignoring the past anymore. I sat down across from my father, the air between us thick with years of regret. He hadn't said much after his initial question, and now he just watched me, waiting for something more. "I don't expect everything to be okay right away," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I just want to understand what went wrong. Why did you both let me go so easily?" My mother's shoulders tensed. "It wasn't easy," she whispered, her hands wringing in her lap. "But we didn't know what to do. We tried, but you pushed us away. And when you left, we thought maybe you didn't want us in your life anymore." Her words felt like a punch to my chest. I had never meant for them to think that. I had been so angry back then, so sure that they had turned their backs on me. But hearing it from her, hearing the hurt in her voice, it made me realize that maybe, just maybe, we had all been hurting in our own way. I turned to my father, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange. "Dad, I know I walked away, but I didn't know what else to do. I felt abandoned. I was angry. But I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how much it was hurting you too." His tired eyes met mine. "You were my daughter, and I failed you," he said softly. "I couldn't see how much I was hurting you by not reaching out. I was so caught up in my own world, in my own struggles, I didn't realize you needed me. I thought you were strong enough to take care of yourself." He paused, and the vulnerability in his eyes pierced through me. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The apology was long overdue, but it felt like a healing balm to the wounds I hadn't realized were still fresh. My father, this man who I had thought was invincible, had always been so distant and stoic. was finally admitting he had made a mistake. "I'm sorry too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I should have tried harder. I should have come back sooner. I let my anger cloud everything, and I hurt you both in the process." My mother's hand reached out, trembling slightly, but it was a small gesture of reconnection. She took my hand, and in that moment I could feel the years of separation and pain slowly melting away. "We all made mistakes, your name," she said. "But what matters now is that we're here, trying to heal, trying to move forward." I felt the tears I had been holding back for so long begin to well up. The weight of 12 years of abandonment, of guilt, of not knowing how to fix things, was finally coming to the surface. It was messy, it was complicated, but it was also the beginning of something. "I don't know where to go from here," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I don't know if everything can be fixed." My father let out a sigh, his eyes softening as he looked at me. "Nothing's perfect, your name. But we'll take it one step at a time, one day at a time. You don't have to fix everything right away." It was then that I realized I didn't need to fix everything. Maybe that was the lesson I had been missing all these years. Maybe the real power lay not in perfection, but in healing and moving forward together, even if it was slow. As the hours passed, we talked. We talked about the past, about the pain we had each endured. And though it wasn't easy, there were still moments of awkwardness, moments where we stumbled over our words. We were finally starting to understand each other. For the first time in a long time, we were acknowledging the hurt, and that felt like a victory in itself. When I finally left their home that evening, it wasn't with all the answers. It wasn't with a magical fix to our broken relationship, but it was with something more important, a sense of hope. Hope that no matter how fractured things had been, we could still rebuild. The next few days passed in a blur of emotions. I went back to my apartment, but my mind was still at my parents' house, still processing everything that had been said, everything that had happened. I had always believed that time would heal the wounds between us, but now I was beginning to realize that healing doesn't happen on its own. It's something you have to work for, something you have to earn. I was determined to put in that work. My parents, though unsure of what the future would look like, seemed to be as committed as I was. They reached out to me every day, checking in, asking how I was doing, and slowly, the awkwardness began to fade. We were still learning how to communicate, still learning how to rebuild trust and understanding. But for the first time, I felt like we were trying. Not out of obligation, but because we all genuinely wanted to fix what had been broken. Then, just as I was starting to feel like we were finding a rhythm, I received a call from Lily, the sister I had always been close to, the one whose wedding had set everything in motion. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said, her voice hesitant as if unsure of how to approach me. "I know things weren't great between us before you left, but I think it's time we talk." I felt my chest tighten at the sound of her voice. The last time I had seen her, things had been awkward, distant. There had been no apology, no closure, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face those old wounds. But at the same time, I knew that if I truly wanted to heal, I couldn't run from these conversations anymore. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "We can talk." We met at a coffee shop a few days later. Lily looked different. The time apart had changed her too. I could see that much. She looked older, a bit more tired, and yet somehow more grounded. She didn't look like the carefree younger sister I remembered. She looked like someone who had seen her own share of struggles. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," she began, after the usual small talk. "I was wrong to shut you out the way I did. I didn't realize how much I hurt you until you left. I've had a lot of time to think about it." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how badly I had needed to hear them until they were finally spoken aloud. It wasn't just the apology, though. It was the vulnerability behind it. It was the fact that she had recognized her mistakes and was taking responsibility for them. "I didn't know how to be there for you when you needed me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was helping, but all I did was push you away. And I regret that, more than you'll ever know." I stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. I had always blamed her for the distance between us, but hearing her speak so honestly made me realize that our relationship had been more complicated than I had allowed myself to understand. It wasn't just her fault. We had both been responsible for the rift. I had been angry and resentful, and I had never given her a chance to explain herself. "I don't know if I can forgive you right away," I said quietly, the words feeling heavy but true. "I've been hurt, Lily, and I've been hurt by the whole family. I don't want to keep living in that anger, but it's not easy to just forget it." She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I want you to know that I'm here now, and I want to make things right, even if it takes time." We sat there for a while, talking about the past, about the things we had never said to each other. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly listening to each other, not just hearing, but understanding. And that made all the difference. When I left the coffee shop, I felt lighter. The weight of the years of silence had been lifted, and I was left with the fragile but growing sense that we could rebuild. It wasn't going to happen overnight. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time I felt like there was a chance. A real chance to move forward, to heal, and to grow closer again. The next few weeks were filled with small but significant steps forward. I continued to spend time with my parents, each visit slowly healing the wounds that had once seemed so insurmountable. We didn't rush anything. We didn't force anything. We just let things happen naturally, one step at a time, and with each step, the bond between us grew stronger. By the time I returned home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. My relationship with my family, though not perfect, was real. We were finally facing our past, acknowledging our mistakes, and starting the long process of rebuilding. And as for Lily, we didn't go back to what we once had. We couldn't. Too much had changed, too much had been broken. But we started again, in our own way. Our relationship was different now. It was more honest, more open. And that, in itself, was a victory. As I stood in front of my apartment door, looking out over the city, I realized that my journey had only just begun. The pain of the past wasn't something I could erase, but I had learned how to live with it. I had learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about moving forward. And moving forward was the only option left.